Debbie, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. These are my disclosures. The work that I'm presenting today is supported by a huge team from Indiana University, as well as colleagues from around the country and around the world. There are many of us. And so, as background, over the past 15 years, sexual behavior trends have changed in important ways that impact people's safety and well-being. These changes have occurred so quickly that many sexual health professionals are unaware of them. And many people themselves are unaware that they may have been exposed to misinformation and have risked harming themselves or a partner. Our team's research is grounded in a desire to understand what kinds of sex people have, how they feel about it, and what shapes their experiences, not to shame or judge at all. We've been working to build an evidence base to support people being able to make more informed choices about their sexual lives. So we've conducted several U.S. nationally representative surveys, college campus representative surveys, interviews at this point with 93 adults between ages 18 and 45 who have engaged in choking or consensual non-consent or CNC, and also done content analyses of social media memes, media articles about sexual choking, TikTok videos, and then my colleague, Dr. Kay Kawada, has led neurological research involving cisgender women who have been choked during sex and not been choked during sex. So first, what is rough sex? It is a very imperfect umbrella term that involves a range of behaviors. Some research from the early 2000s with college students showed that they generally considered rough sex to be things like light spanking, hair pulling, biting, vigorous sex, or pinning a partner down during sex, and did not generally think of things like choking or kind of making somebody have sex, if you will, or slapping the genitals or punching somebody as rough sex. Those were generally thought of as more about aggression or violence, but that was between 2006 and 2011. And in my own teaching, I noticed some real changes in my students in how they talked about what they called rough sex. And in 2020, just before the pandemic, we did our own survey of about 5,000 randomly sampled college students and found that things had changed. And that while the things in the box on the left, like the light spanking and hair pulling, were still considered rough sex by these students, they now very commonly, in fact, choking was the #1 behavior they associated with rough sex, and also face slapping, torso slapping, genital slapping, consensual non-consent, and punching. So a range of behaviors have become more common. These are some data from our recent National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior, a U.S. nationally representative survey of about 9,600 people. And just as some examples we can see with women, for example, 32% of women ages 18 to 24 and 41% of 25 to 29-year-olds reported having ever been choked. This is actually with consent in their lives. Whereas you can see for 50 and over, it's 5% in their 50s and 1% in their 60s, and it continues to go down after that. So these are just some examples, but you can see that the younger adults are much more likely to report having ever engaged in a range of these behaviors. These are some data that have struck us about having genitals slapped. And so we've been hearing a lot more about this from our own college students. And so, where I had a female student a few years ago who said, "Why are guys always slapping people's vulvas during sex?" And I was like, "Are they?" And the room erupted with young women saying, "Yeah, and they don't even ask, they just do it. It's so weird, I don't get it." And so I said, "Well, we're doing a survey. Let's find out, how often this is happening." And indeed, 1 out of 4 women ages 25 to 29 reported having their genitals slapped. It was called with consent, but when we actually ask them, they say consent to them means more that it's okay with them, not that anyone ever asked them about it. And again, you can see the numbers are pretty low for women in their 60s, 70s, and beyond, so much, much higher in the younger adult years. Our research has focused largely on choking because it's the most prevalent and also the most consequential in terms of health. So in case you're not familiar with this, it is usually described as consensual. People are usually using one hand, but sometimes two, less often an arm, a leg, or a ligature like a collar or a belt or a tie to press against or squeeze the neck. Because it is external pressure to the neck that can reduce or stop airflow or blood flow, it is technically a form of strangulation, but nobody really uses that term. And people, some of them are intending to do what they call a blood choke or restrict only the blood flow. Others are intending to only restrict breathing by pressing on the trachea, and about 1/3 of those that we've surveyed don't really know what's happening when they press against the neck, but they are doing what they believe to be a pleasurable sexual activity. They report various intensities, anywhere from extremely light to extremely intense. So in other words, they use the full range of a self-reported scale of 1 to 10, with an average of about 4 for an intensity. And it used to be a very rare behavior. Sometimes we have younger people who say, well, hasn't this just always been really common? And it hasn't. Now, there's not a lot of historical data, but the historical data that we do have from the early 2000s, for example, at 2 LGBTQ events in New York City in 2003 and 4, found that just 5% of lesbian and bisexual women and 8% of gay and bisexual men reported having engaged in any form of asphyxiation or breath play at all. So the big umbrella of breath play, not just choking the specific one. And then in 2011 to 12, an online convenience survey of about 1,600 heterosexual adults. This was about pornography and online porn use. These researchers found that 13% of women and 9% of men reported having been choked with hands, specifically by a partner. So we can see the numbers starting to inch up around 2011. But lo and behold, in that early 2020 survey, in our random sample of 5,000 undergraduate students, we found that 64% of women, 29% of men, and 56% of trans and non-binary students reported having been choked, usually consensually, but again, it doesn't always mean discussion. We've now done 4 of these campus representative surveys, and the numbers are always stable or slightly increased. We now differentiate between consensual and non-consensual, and so you can see there are many people, 18% of women, 7% of men, and 11% of trans and non-binary students reporting non-consensual choking as well. So both consensual and non-consensual are prevalent. So who is most affected by choking? Well, young adults under age 45, women, trans, non-binary, and other gender non-conforming folks, sexual orientation minorities, and specifically bisexual women, bisexual men, and gay men are more likely than heterosexual people and lesbians to report being choked, though rates are high across the board. So here's just one example from another U.S. nationally representative survey where we found that 1 in 3% or 1 in 3 of 18 to 24-year-old women, or 35%, were choked at their most recent sexual event, broadly defined. So like their most recent hookup or sexual event, or 11% of the 25 to 39-year-olds, and then 3% or less for 40 and above. And they were not very often choking their partners, as you can see on the right-hand side of that. These are just with women in orange and men in blue. Again, some demonstration of differences by age and gender, with it more often affecting women as compared to men, and also more often affecting young adults. It's not just an American thing. There's newer data out just over the past year and a half. 2 studies out of Italy, 2 now out of Australia, and 1 now out of Iceland, showing almost the same exact patterns with young adults and more often affecting women and trans and non-binary and sexual orientation minorities. Now, because we've now done these 4 campus representative surveys, we can also look at changes over time, and it's becoming more frequent. So it's becoming a more regular part of people's repertoires, with 22% of our students now reporting having been choked at least 25 times. And in our nationally representative surveys, we find that it's also common among people of reproductive age, including pregnant people, with about 1 in 6 pregnant people reporting that they were choked at their most recent sexual event. So when we think about that nice, healthy oxygen that we want flowing through the body at all times for a developing fetus, we need to be thinking about how we're going to engage with this topic with pregnant patients. So choking also is often beginning in adolescence, and that also seems to be becoming a little earlier than even a few years ago. So in that 2020 survey, 1 in 4 of our college students who had ever been choked were first choked between ages 12 and 17. That number has now crept up to 36, first being choked by age 17. So where are people learning about choking? All sorts. Friends, partners, pornography. Guys are more often saying pornography. Cisgender women and trans and non-binary folks often talk about online fan fiction, as well as social media, and a whole range of shows and celebrities are talking about it. When I ask my students, I learn about new places all the time. This winter, the #1 song in the country for 6 weeks was Lovin' on Me by Jack Harlow with the line, "I'm vanilla, baby. I'll choke you, but I ain't no killer, baby." So referencing choking as vanilla and also really sort of talking about these connections or lacks of connections related to violence. And in fact, we saw this in social media memes where sometimes there was some discussion with these hundreds of memes with the hashtag #ChokeMeDaddy or other similar ones. For example, playing with the issue of one hand versus two hands, when you made him angry earlier just so he can choke you with both hands during sex. Or talking about girls and women as being confusing, like girls who like to be choked, tied up, and slapped during sex are also the ones who cry when you yell at them. And there were a number of those that we found in that category. We also have analyzed online media articles and found a huge amount of misinformation in them. Generally, they will indicate that people can die, but it's really rare. They don't usually discuss non-death related outcomes. And most of them will say that there is a safe or proper way to choke. Usually what they say is just press the sides of the neck. And they don't really talk about really what that's doing in terms of the carotid arteries and blood to the brain. Generally, they'll say, make sure you get consent, but usually without any detail. And so there's a lot of misinformation online. Some of the side effects that I want to highlight are that around 40% of our students who have been choked report being unable to breathe or speak, which of course has implications for consent or withdrawal of consent. And about 1 in 5 have reported alterations in consciousness, which in other strangulation research is related to long-term implications for mental health, as well as neurocognitive issues. We've also found around 5% report memory loss related to the event, which can be a decent proxy for loss of consciousness. We have about 3 to 4% who report actual loss of consciousness in any given event. And I invite you to read some of the papers by my colleague, Dr. Keisuke Kawada, related to some of the brain differences that he has found with women who have been choked during sex. And I see that I'm out of time, so I'm only going to say briefly that about 10% of our randomly sampled college students report engaging in consensual non-consent, or CNC, which is generally enacted as a form of rape play. So we've done now this twice. It's about 10%. It almost always involves choking and other forms of rough sex. We have no data at the population level, but we find that even though this is supposed to be a fully consensual role play act, as we would expect in kink and BDSM communities, in the mainstream version of it, there's a lot of consent violations that we've seen in our interviews with people. So I invite you to also pay a lot more attention to that and become familiar with the acronym CNC, because people are learning again about this from TikTok, and that's not a helpful source of information. So thank you very much.